Welcome everyone to Caring for Yourself While Advocating for Your Client webinar. My name is Marisa Barrera. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and ella. I'm a social worker with the Children's Immigration Law Academy, or CILA for short. I'll be joined by two wonderful guest speakers from the Tahrir Justice Center, Samantha and Natalie. They could wait. Be great. Thank you. Some of you probably know who we are and others may not. CILA is a project of the American Bar Association Commission on Immigration. We are a legal resource center. We are a capacity building organization. And here at CILA, we don't think children should have to go to court alone. And that's the primary reason we're doing this work. CILA is located in Houston, Texas, although we have staff in Dallas and San Antonio, Texas, and also in the state of California and Illinois. Many of our services are available nationally, while a few remain Texas specific. We provide technical assistance regarding case-specific questions relating to children and youth with immigration cases. We offer 6 working groups to provide space for advocates to collaborate. We provide training and reading resources. We host platforms featuring pro bono opportunities across the country and provide resources related to pro bono. Please visit our website to learn more about CILA and how to join these working groups. Before moving on with the presentation, I would like to discuss some housekeeping matters. This is going to be an hour-and-a-half long webinar. Please enter your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. We're going to try to answer some questions as we go along, but we'll have some time at the end for questions. But if for some reason we're not able to answer your question, please follow up by submitting a technical assistance request to CILA or to the Tahrir Justice Centers. And they'll be happy to provide additional guidance directly to you. This webinar will be recorded and will be posted on our website at a later time. We will be providing a copy of this PowerPoint and some resources for all of you. At the end, we will be providing a survey for feedback. Please take that time to complete that, as that will help us identify areas of improvement. Let us know what we're doing right and ideas for future trainings and webinars. Also, this course has been approved for 1.5 hours of CLE credit, including 0.25 hours of ethic credits. If you're licensed outside of Texas, please complete the survey to request an attendance letter. For Texas licensed social workers, LPCs, LMFTs, we're going to be providing 1.5 CEUs, including 0.25 hours of CEUs upon request. We want to take the opportunity to present a couple of questions to you. Oftentimes, these questions serve as icebreakers, but many times these questions help us learn more about the work being done on the ground and the challenges being faced. Your answers will help us tailor future trainings and resources. We encourage your participation by scanning the QR code with your phone or smart device, or you can also go to slido.com and insert the number in the slide, 1315443. We're going to give everyone a moment to do so before we launch the first question. Our first question: are you working with a client who is currently experiencing domestic violence or intimate partner violence? I still see a lot of people trying to answer the question, so we're going to give it a moment once the popcorn has slowed down. Thank you so much for your participation. It seems like a little more than half of you are currently navigating this challenge with your clients. Hopefully, we'll provide some helpful guidance in this webinar. Thank you. Our second question: what do you find most challenging about the work? Lack of resources, crisis management, resources denials, figuring out ways to help, boundaries, engagement, the emotions that come up, finding access to resources, creating boundaries, the lack of resources. I can relate. Emotional toll, crisis management, not getting emotionally involved, resources, building rapport, re-traumatization. That's a difficult one. lack of resources, boundaries. So it seems like boundaries, lack of resources, crisis management are the trend here. Hearing the stories, emotional impact, fear of the emotions that come up, finding counseling for clients, engagement. Yeah, it could be very, very challenging. I mean, we want to be able to help everyone, but sometimes the situation is beyond our and their control. Thank you so much for participating in this questions. Thank you. We're going to go ahead and move on. We know that this is a very complex topic to cover, and we could talk about it for days, but instead we're going to be focusing on the points highlighted on this slide. The goal is to provide you with information and practical tips helpful to your legal and advocacy efforts with immigrant survivors of domestic violence. We know that the immigration process can be very challenging to navigate. Now imagine going through it while you're currently living or having fled an abusive relationship or circumstance. Unfortunately, that is the reality for so many, including unaccompanied immigrant youth. If you haven't yet, there's a good chance that at some point as an advocate, you will find yourself navigating this type of challenges with your clients. Some will still be in the midst of it, and others might have escaped and are now dealing with the aftermath. We're not going to spend much time on definitions or stats. However, we did want to provide you some numbers, vocabulary for understanding, and some info for context. We often hear the following terms: domestic violence, intimate partner violence, gender-based violence being used interchangeably. But what does it all mean? Domestic violence, it is an umbrella term that encompasses intimate partner violence, family violence, and gender-based violence. Intimate partner violence usually relates to it's a general term to capture any type of violence, abusive behavior used by one partner to maintain power or control of another in an intimate relationship. Intimate partner violence can occur between people of any gender, identity, or sexual orientation. Family violence is an abusive behavior that occurs between members of a family or household who are or not involved in a romantic relationship. It could go either way. Gender-based violence is a general term used to capture any type of violence that is rooted in exploiting unequal power relationships between genders. Gender-based violence can impact anyone. It can show up in many different ways, such as in domestic violence, including familiar and intimate partner violence, femicide, violence and harassment in the workplace, sexual violence, war crimes, including rape, sexual trafficking, female genital mutilation, forced marriage, and child marriage. We all know this type of violence does not discriminate, as it can happen to anyone. However, there are some populations that are more vulnerable, such as women, in particular immigrant or undocumented women, teens or young people, or LGBTQ people. According to the National Organization for Women, intimate partner violence impacts 1 in 3 women, but immigrant and undocumented women are particularly vulnerable to intimate partner violence, as abusers often use their undocumented partner's immigration status as means of control. Abuse rates among immigrant women are as high as 49.8%. This is almost 3 times the national average. Most of this violence is intimate partner violence. Worldwide, almost 1/3 of women ages 15 to 49 who have been in a relationship report that they have been subjected to some form of physical or sexual violence by their intimate partner. The majority of the domestic violence awareness movement has focused on heterosexual relationships, leaving out the LGBTQ community. However, recent research shows that LGBTQ members fall victim to domestic violence at equal or even higher rates compared to their heterosexual counterparts. The risks and barriers are many. I think we have all heard the infamous question, or maybe you have thought about it yourself. Why don't they just leave? But only if it was as simple as asking the question. It is important to recognize and understand that the risks and the challenges that it entails. For example, did you know that 75% of domestic violence related homicides occurred upon separation? And that there is a 75% increase of violence upon separation for at least 2 years. There are many other challenges that our guest speakers will be touching on, such as isolation, retaliation, manipulation, financial dependency, homelessness, and fear of deportation. It is a privilege to introduce our guest speakers who have been advocating for survivors of domestic, intimate, gender-based violence for over a decade. They lead their advocacy efforts with compassion, empathy, and determination. Samantha is a supervising attorney at the Tahirih Justice Center, will be offering her perspective as an attorney on the challenges and best practices in working with survivors of domestic, intimate, gender-based violence. And Natalie, a social service advocate at the Tahirih Justice Center, will be able to do the same, but from a social service standpoint. Please be mindful that some of the perspectives or some of the information provided in this webinar might or might not align with the mandates or requirements of your role, profession, organization, or a particular case. As some guidelines, policies, ethics, for example, might vary from state to state or even from one organization to another. It's recommended that you acquaint yourself with the requirements, needs, or ethical obligations that pertain with your circumstances. And now I'll hand the spotlight to them. Natalie will be next.
Okay. Hi, everyone. And thank you, Marissa and your team at SELA for the introduction and the invitation to be part of this webinar. My name is Natalie Matuzak, and I am a social services advocate at the Tahirih Justice Center here in Houston. And I am part of our interdisciplinary client services team, which includes both legal and social services staff. We work together to support and serve immigrant survivors of gender-based violence. And we wanted to start today by showing you the power and control wheel, and it's particular to immigrants. In this wheel, you may have seen before when people talk about, when advocates or service providers talk about domestic violence and the abuse that entails. So this wheel is specific to immigrants, but there are many out there, and it's really a helpful illustration that shows the common tactics abusers use to not only gain, but also maintain power and control over their victims. And I also just want to note, and like Marissa mentioned, at Tahirih, we, or for me primarily, I do work, the majority of our clients are women, immigrant survivor women who are often mothers as well. So you may hear me use, she pronouns a lot, and that's just based on my perspective with the clients I serve. But again, wanting to recognize that abuse and domestic violence do not discriminate, and it affects people of all identities. So I just wanted to note that. And so when you look at the wheel, and this will be included in the resources that you'll receive after the presentation, so you can look at it in more depth, but it shows these patterns of abusive behavior. And this can be physical violence, sexual violence. It can be threats and intimidation, emotional abuse, economic deprivation. It can involve threats, intimidation, coercion, and really it is these tactics. The ultimate goal is to gain and maintain that power and control over the victim. So I also think it's important to note that domestic violence and intimate partner violence, it's not just a single event, it's a pattern of behavior. So this and immigrant survivors are particularly vulnerable because the abuser has additional, it gives abusers additional ways to exploit and instill fear when their victims are also immigrants. So, and we'll talk more about that and what that looks like. And so, yeah, this wheel shows some common abuse tactics and, things that we see a lot, like a partner exploiting the victim's immigration status. And it can even, look like just basic day-to-day things like withholding food, withholding medication, access to medical care, forcing a partner to basically, do things they don't want to do, whether that's exploitive sexual acts or even to engage in criminal activity. So it's really complex, and it's a pattern of behavior. And I can move. I don't know if I have control to take us to the next slide. Let me see. Oh, here we go. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Marissa. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. So I just zoomed in here because I wanted to show you the section of the wheel that looks at using children and how children kind of factor into this pattern of domestic violence. So often, even if the child is not a direct recipient of abuse, they are often caught in the middle, sadly. They may be witnessing domestic violence in the home, or abusers may even use them to inflict violence on another parent, often a mother, not always, but often. And so this is one of the ways, these are some of the ways that kids are, caught in the middle. And like I said, we at Tahare, we work with immigrant survivors. And so sadly, we know that not only are they experiencing abuse, now, but often they, throughout the process of immigration have experienced abuse and, experienced trauma on their immigration journey. And once they come here, it's not uncommon, unfortunately, for them to be re-victimized, once they're in the US. So, and at Tahare, we most often work with immigrant women and mothers. And so in my work, I'm often working with minor clients through their parents' cases. We do also serve minor clients who are unaccompanied or not living with their parents due to abuse or neglect, but my work is often supporting children through their parent. And so what we see a lot is that even after a survivor has escaped abuse or fled from their abuser, they may be divorced, but even after that, they are forced, especially in the state of Texas, to often they're forced in court ordered to co-parent with their abuser. And this is and so you can imagine the additional layer of trauma that creates for survivors and children. So both, adult and child survivors. And, as they're going through family law proceedings, which is something we see a lot with our clients, they are having to face their abusers in court, for custody and child support hearings. And so even after they've escaped, the abuse can continue, which is where they really need support. And I also want to note, as we get into this topic of reporting, that immigrant parents especially are very terrified at the thought of being separated from their children. And, it's understandable given, recent years where we have seen families, especially, immigrant families, cruelly separated from their parents, especially here in Texas, right, as a border state. So, even if parents aren't experiencing this directly, just hearing about child protective services or, the thought or the idea of possibly being separated from their children can be very terrifying for them. And like Marissa mentioned, it's especially true for immigrants who are undocumented or have pending applications for immigration relief. And I also wanted to mention, in addition to what's here in the wheel, this is another way that immigrants are really vulnerable in this dynamic of domestic violence, because, an abuser a common tactic they use is to isolate their victims. They may, exhibit a lot of controlling behaviors where they don't want their partner to work. And that can happen to anyone experiencing domestic violence. But when you're an immigrant, on top of all of that, the abuser can, threaten to report you to immigration. Or what if you don't speak the language? And so you don't know the laws and how things work in your new country, right? So you don't know that you can report things, that you can go to the police, that there's help available. So it's it really creates these additional vulnerabilities. Let me go to the next slide. Okay. And so we wanted to talk about some of the signs of abuse. We kind of talked about the different types of kind of the different categories and the dynamic, what that can look like. But we also wanted to talk about some of the signs. And I want to note that, and this is true for both adults and children, but each person is different and they're going to respond to trauma differently. And especially for kids, it's really going to, it can be different based on their age, developmental stage, gender, culture. All of these factors can play a role in how trauma and the effects of violence show up. And it can, especially for kids, it can also depend on, were they exposed or were they, the direct recipient of the violence or abuse? Were they, what was their proximity to that? And also a really important factor is how their caregivers or how their parents respond. So that can be a really big protective factor for them, even when they have been exposed. And yes, and I wanted to, so yeah, these effects, they can be physical, which, we talk about in the first few points here. Behavioral, especially in kids, you see a lot of behavioral changes or challenges. It can be psychological, cognitive. So, things like physical injuries, which, can be very visible. It can also look like neglect. So if you are working with a child or see a child who, isn't wearing appropriate clothing, like it's really cold and they're dressed like they're, it's summertime, that can be an indicator that they're not that they're being neglected by their caregivers. If you notice frequent illnesses, injuries, especially things that are left untreated, or sudden and unexplained injuries, that can be a sign. And also a lot of times, if you work in the school systems or with kids in that way, these things do often show up, and educators will notice this in school. So maybe their attendance has changed, maybe they're skipping school, not participating the way they used to. So really just looking for those behavioral changes. And also, other factors that can affect this too with immigrant survivors, our language barriers. There is often in, first generation, the first generation within families to grow up in the US, we often see conflict between older generations and, kids trying to make sense of their culture and their heritage and reconciling that with like the environment they find them in now, which is often very different from their culture or their home country, right? And so, they're trying to navigate a new culture. They may be struggling to fit in at school. And we know with immigrants, especially, there may be a mistrust of police and different systems that they're interacting with. So all of this can make it complex to identify and ask, when you're asking yourself, is it cause for concern or not? So it's sadly not always an easy answer. And let me move to the next slide. Okay, so just some additional signs that are important to know about in case you suspect abuse. it can, if the child seems detached or avoids their caregiver, if the child is withdrawn or shows extreme behaviors. And some examples, to give you some examples of like these behaviors, I'm talking about like reckless, more impulsive behaviors. And we see this a lot in older children, so in teens. So this can look like skipping school, substance abuse, running away, being involved in a violent or abusive dating relationship, and younger children especially, they may show signs of regression. So resorting to temper tantrums when they, previously were able to communicate effectively and use their words. They may have difficulty sleeping or eating. And especially in the young ones, it's common to see them revert to more immature behavior. So acting younger or needier than they previously have. And even it can even be things like, bedwetting when the child has been toilet trained for a long time. So really you want to look for those changes in behavior. Move to the next slide. Okay. And so, like Marissa shared, I'm working here in Houston, Texas. So a lot of my information is based on Texas, since that's where I work. And I can't really comment on other states' laws and requirements, but I do think, so, it is important to consult like your local authorities and licensing authorities. But I do think this information a lot of it is general, and I think can be helpful regardless of where you live. But here in Texas, there is information about mandatory reporting in the Texas Family Code, which I've linked here, and you can you'll get a copy of the presentation, so you can look at this in more detail if you would like. But basically, the bottom line of it in Texas is that all Texans are considered mandatory reporters of suspected abuse or neglect of a child. And I've included the language here from the Texas Family Code. Within the code, there's also additional language specific to professionals, and they go into the definition of what a professional, how they define that. And it's often people, like attorneys, social workers, people who are licensed by the state in some way. And especially people who throughout the course of regular work interact with children frequently. But I do encourage you to look at that to see if you fall into those any of those categories. But the bottom line is, even professional or not, we're all mandatory reporters. Okay. And I wanted to look at some reporting considerations with you. And this comes from the Children's Advocacy Centers of Texas, some of this information. So again, it is Texas specific, but it's important to know that you're reporting child abuse or neglect, your report is confidential. And so as long as the report is made in good faith and without malice, that's the language they use here in Texas, you're immune from any liability. So, it's if it turns out they do an investigation and your suspicion was wrong, you will not be penalized for that, as long as it was in good faith and without malice. So also some safety considerations, which we will talk more about throughout the presentation. But if you request to have your identity be made confidential, the Department of Family and Protective Services in Texas will honor that. So they will not share your identity with the child's parents, with alleged perpetrators, or anyone else without your consent or a court order. Now, if they are able to share your identity if to law enforcement and the district attorney if the case requires further investigation. So there are some exceptions to that, but generally they will protect your identity for safety reasons. And I also wanted to mention these, these situations and these questions are not easy, and you may encounter clients, whether you're working with a parent and a child, and maybe the parent is also being abused, and you're needing to make a report about abuse of the child. People can be, if you tell them, I have to make a report because I suspect abuse or neglect, they may be very resistant to that, which is understandable. But it's really important to talk with clients, especially when you first start the relationship. So for us at Tahare, that's at intake or the retainer for our legal colleagues. But it's really important to talk with them about confidentiality, what the exceptions are, so that they know, what that is. So for us, I can speak for social services. That's one of the forms we go over with them at intake, and letting them know, if I suspect child abuse or neglect, I'm obligated to report that. So yes. I'll go to the next slide. Okay. And I wanted to share some just recommendations and considerations as well. So if you suspect, child abuse or neglect, it's helpful to consult your supervisor or your organization's leadership. Or like in our case at Tahare, we work in a very interdisciplinary way. So it's also important to consult our colleagues. Like for me, that's my legal counterparts, so that everybody's on the same page, and we can, kind of look at it as a team. And that's useful just for reporting, but it's also useful because, you need support. We all do in doing this work, and having to make a report like that, knowing the repercussions it can have on your client, on the family. It's not easy. It's not easy when you're grappling with all of that. So it's really important to have support, and to seek that support from your team. And another thing that I would suggest is reviewing any internal policies or procedures your organization may have around the reporting of child abuse. If you don't have those procedures, I would recommend creating them, looking at that with your teams. Some organizations even have specific like consent to release, like release of information forms, when they determine they need to make a report to CPS, to Child Protective Services, and they will go over that release of information with their client to kind of explain the process and what that looks like, so they're informed about it. And then Samantha, my colleague, is going to touch on this even more, but also check with your local license or your state licensing authority wherever you live about your ethical duty to your client. And this is really, it gets really complex because you've got state laws, you've got your professional ethical obligations for most of us here, and then you're also having to you may have additional policies that you need to comply with within your organization. So it can be really complex when you have to make these reports. Okay, let me move to the next. Okay, so I wanted to talk with you about best practices for responding when a child reveals abuse or neglect. So, some helpful things to say are, thank you for telling me, I believe you, letting them know you do not deserve to be treated this way. This isn't your fault. Abuse is never the victim's fault. And so it's really important to say that. And that's true for both adults and children. But those are just some best, practices. You want to, remain calm. Let the child talk. It can be really difficult for anyone to disclose this to someone, and it's important to let them talk, show that you care, you're interested, you're concerned, and support and validate their feelings, and then take action. And you want, again, along with remaining calm, you don't want to panic. The importance of letting the child talk is, they will share, like letting them share, listening, not pressing them, because that can, that may make them hesitant to share more. You also do not want to promise things you cannot control. As tempting as it may be, it can be really hard when a child discloses abuse to you. And, I think all of us, it's tempting to want to say it's going to be okay. This isn't going to happen to you again. But the reality is, the unfortunate reality is we cannot control that. So we want to really keep it focused on what we can control and supporting them the best we can. You do not want to confront the offender, again, for safety reasons. That's the job of Child Protective Services and law enforcement to investigate and deal with that. You do not want to minimize the child's feelings or overwhelm with questions. So those are just some general recommendations. And so I want to get into what to do. You suspect abuse and now you've determined you need to make a report. So how do you handle that? And I've put some steps, and this is just, as a guideline. It may look slightly different for you when you find yourself in this situation. But step one I wrote here is, basically similar to what I said before, that the importance of consulting with a supervisor or other people on your team. And I do want to let you know, you don't have to do this. It's not required by law. It's often helpful for advocates when they're in this situation. Step two is, and this is something we see a lot at Tahare because we do work with families. So if there is a survivor parent involved, so a non-battering parent, right, a protective parent who's also a victim of abuse, you can consider informing them about the report. And of course, if it's going to pose a risk to the child, don't, disregard that. But if it seems appropriate, that's something you can consider doing, and that is done. Especially if the report is against their partner, who's, the abuser, it can be helpful for them to participate in the process. And it can also demonstrate to Child Protective Services what they call protective factors that the protective parent is attempting, right, in this process. So and also if you're working with teens, and it seems appropriate, you can consider letting them know that you are making a report, and give them the option to be present or support them with making a report of their own. These are all ways that advocates can be supportive. And when talking to kids about this, it is important to explain, what's going on and kind of let them know what to expect. So and it's going to be age dependent, right? You want to say it in an age appropriate way, but it could be as simple as, look, thank you so much for telling me. In order for you to be safe, I'm going to need to, share this information, and you will need to talk with another person. This may be CPS or the police, but you may need to talk to them about your experience. And I want you to know that I'm here to support you, and you can ask any questions as many times as you need to. I'm here. But if you've made the determination you need to report, that's one way that you can approach that with a child. Again, it also gets at the importance of confidentiality and, making sure clients understand the limitations of that. And that will look different depending on your role. And Samantha will talk more about the legal perspective, but it's going to depend on your role. And so step 3, explain the CPS system and the process so that the survivor parent understands, right? They understand what to expect and what's next. And we've included in our resources that will be shared 2 guides that you can use that are helpful to show families, to show parents. And it talks about what to expect and their rights in the CPS system, and it's available in English and Spanish. Okay, and then step 4 is safety planning. This is very important when you're dealing with domestic violence survivors, whether it's active or they've fled. Safety is always very important. And so you most likely will need to do safety planning with the survivor child and or parent about any potential for escalating violence as a result of the CPS report. And it can be really difficult to have these conversations. And as hard as it is, it is really important to think about worst case scenarios when you're talking with your clients, not because you want to scare them or alarm them, but it's preparing for the worst, hoping for the best, basically. So you want them to have a plan for what, the worst, if the worst case scenario happens, so that when they're in, if it comes to that, they have those steps in mind of what to do, and they've thought through it beforehand, which is really helpful. And I included in step 5 some of the information that you will be asked when you go to make the report. And you can do that. You can do it online, and I've included the website here, texasabusehotline.org, or you can do it by phone. If it's an emergency, if it's an urgent situation, they want you to do this by phone rather than the website. Okay, and so I wanted to share some recommendations and best practices for supporting children who have been exposed to DV. So as we talked about with some of the behavior, like the effects you'll see may show up in behavior, it's really important to appreciate that many behaviors that are problematic seemingly began as understandable attempts to cope with really experiences kids should not have to face. It's important to be patient because, especially with survivors, it really takes time to build trust and rapport. And just by you as a caring, safe adult in their life, showing concern, that can go a really long way to help for providing immediate support, but also helping kids build resilience and heal from the trauma they've experienced. If you can, it's always good to give choices, and this can be a way to kind of counteract some of the abuse that they've experienced and help them, instead of feeling out of control and helpless, kind of help them feel more empowered and like they have some sense of control. Also fully explaining your process so they know what to expect, right? And for kids, it's really important for any survivor, but for children, if you can create a calm, stable, predictable environment for meetings or even within your organization's office space, that's really going to be helpful. I know at Tahare, we have like a children's playroom that's set up just for kids to help them be more comfortable when they have to come to our office for meetings with their parents or for their own meeting. Okay. And then another important thing is addressing kids' basic needs, right? So this looks like food, clothing, shelter. If they have been experiencing abuse and neglect, chances are those basic needs have not been addressed or met. So it's going to be really hard for kids to start healing and start that journey if they don't have their basic needs met, because that's just super foundational for kids. And that can, even if you don't provide resources directly, that providing connection to other places that can, and other helpful services, that's something that anyone can do. And especially for immigrant survivors, seeking culturally competent service providers whenever possible is best. And I also put here, understanding each survivor in the context of their life experience and culture, so important. Culture, your background, it affects everything, including the way you experience violence, the way you heal and recover. It's going to look different based on your culture of origin. And if applicable, support the survivor parent. And this comes from some research by, the name is Lundy Bancroft, who said there is a wide consensus that children's recovery from exposure to DV depends largely on the quality of their relationship with the non-battering parent. So at Tahirih, we really try to preserve that relationship and help strengthen it. And because we know that exposure to domestic violence is harmful for children, but it can be very harmful as well to be separated from a protective parent or a parent who is also a victim. Okay, and I briefly wanted to touch on teen dating violence. There are some special considerations with that are important to note. So there are a lot of similarities to teen dating violence and domestic or intimate partner violence, but there are also some unique aspects of it to consider. So like the fact that it's gonna most likely, we see this a lot happening in the schools. So it may not be like in a home environment, but it may be at school, after school, weekends, whereas domestic violence can, occur anytime you're at home, basically, or with an abusive partner. And really to help kids through that, or teens, it's really helpful to educate them on healthy relationships, what that looks like. You also need to consider if you're working directly with a teen, or are you helping through a parent, right? Maybe you're serving a parent who has concerns about dating violence for their teen. So those are some important considerations. In Texas, it is possible to obtain a protective order, even if they're under 18. And I included a slide on healthy relationships. That's one that can be very helpful when talking to teens, just showing them and talking to them about what that looks like. And then finally, I just wanted to note, that as heavy of a topic as this is, change is possible. Immigrant survivors are resilient. Healing happens. They do break cycles of intergenerational trauma and abuse. And this just kind of goes to show you some of the ways you can advocate for your clients from an empowering perspective. So I will turn it over to my colleague, Sam. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Marissa, I believe I have control of the slides now. Let me double check. Sorry, there might be a slight delay, but I'll start in the interest of time until I can move the slides. As we've heard from Natalie, and as you all know, probably even those of you who might not have necessarily experienced working with DV or IPV survivors, it's a really difficult job, right? But it's even more complicated when you're dealing with a client who is a minor, because in addition to all the other considerations that you would have with any client, now you have to wonder whether you need to report, whether you can report, whether you have to report. So reporting DV is never a straight answer. So I'll take you through some of the considerations on whether to report. But know that wherever you're located, whatever your jurisdiction, it's never a black and white issue. Even in Texas admittedly has very, very stringent laws It's kind of one of the extreme, one side of the extreme, right? Where everybody's a mandatory reporter and there are no exceptions for attorneys. But even in Texas, where I've practiced for the past almost 15 years, it's never been a really straight answer. I've never had any time where I thought, oh yeah, I've got to report. I'm going to do it right now. Never. The first thing that you need to do is figuring out what kind of state, what kind of jurisdiction you live in, right? In some states, reporting child or elder abuse is mandatory, like in Texas. In some states, it's permissive. In some states, it's a little bit more murky, and it will depend not only on your jurisdiction, but also on where you're licensed and if you're licensed and who you work with. So let's unpack all this. There's a lot to unpack. So some states have specific statutes, right? So like Natalie said, in Texas, you need to look at the family code, but it's not the only place, unfortunately, right? In Texas, I actually have a whole list of provisions that relate to mandatory reporting. They're found in the family code at, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, like 12 different sections, in the health and safety code as well, and in the penal code, because actually in Texas, it's a misdemeanor to fail to report. So all these things together make up the law of reporting. And I suspect that it is the same in many other states where it's not just one nicely packaged statute, it's kind of all over the place. There's a really, really good resource, and it is in the resource packet that goes with this webinar. It's called childwelfare.gov. It's a federal government website, and it's listed by state. So by state, you can go and find out the laws and where the laws are in your state, and I encourage you to do that. That's where I certainly went when doing the research for this, and I found some really, really interesting provisions, even some that I really had never looked for my own jurisdiction. So it's really a good resource. So usually the laws regarding reporting are in conflict. They're going to be in conflict with the right of your client to have privileged communications with you, and or the duty of confidentiality that you have to your client. And that usually will conflict with the duty that you have to report. Again, like Natalie said, reach out to your state bar and other licensing authority for guidance. That's going to be really important to sort of see the precedents, what has been okay, what has not been okay in terms of reporting, who's been found, sort of liable of breaching their duty or violating their client's rights. And then one of the best practices is to always talk to your client about your obligations in terms of the law, right? This is not my policy. This is not my organization that says that this is what we do. This is the law. And I have a license. And if I want to keep this license to keep helping and representing you, there are certain things that I've got to do. And that's a really difficult and tough conversation to have, right? Because especially as attorneys and other professions that have really strong confidentiality components, right? We want our clients to trust us and we want them to tell us stuff. But sometimes, that we just can't keep it to ourselves, right? And it's really a difficult conversation. I don't think that I have, particular pointers besides making it very clear that this is the law. And most of our clients will understand that. And still encouraging them to disclose as much as possible. I usually also make it clear that it is not a black and white issue, and that even though I am a mandatory reporter, I would always tell them that I'm going to report, make a very purposeful sort of determination. I will discuss it with other people. None of this would be a surprise, but that it would come up, right? So the next question is, well, do I have to report? Can I report? And those two questions are linked, right? It's the shall and the may in the law, and they're often linked because do I have to report is what does the law say in my state, and can I report is what do my ethical duties tell me I can and cannot do. As a general rule, but from what I can see in most states, attorneys are accepted from that. Attorneys and then other professions as well, other professionals. And by attorneys, I mean attorneys and also people who work under them, right? So, paralegals, anybody in your office might fall under that umbrella. But that's not the majority. That's not the majority of the states. Most of the states actually have some sort of hybrid, right? So the other thing that's really important to look at in the law and to determine whether you have to report or even can report is what's the standard, right? What is the standard to make a report? Do you have to suspect? Some states you have to suspect. In Texas, by the way, it is reason to believe. You have to have reason to believe. So it's a slightly higher standard than suspect. But in other jurisdictions, it might be, even a stronger term. So that's the standard, right? Do you have reason to believe, right? Do you believe your client when they say, that somebody is being abused, right? So that's the first thing to look at. And then you need to also kind of look at what has to be reported. Not every single instance of physical violence, for example, has to be reported. So in Texas, it's abuse and neglect, right? So let's take abuse, for example. Abuse is defined, and I don't have the citation handy, I'm sorry, but essentially abuse is, physical, mental violence, but that is not for the purpose of discipline, right? So in Texas, for example, if you want to spank your children, you can, it's legal, it's not abuse, right? So, would I have to report if my client is spanking their children for discipline? I might not like it. I might not think that it is the right thing to do, but it is not abuse in the state of Texas, as long as obviously there are no injuries or anything like that, right? So really clearly determining what it is that I have to report. And then once you've made that determination, this is when you need to ask the next question, right? So you've determined now whether you have to report or whether you can report. And your next question is going to be, should I report, right? So this is more of a moral judgment. This is more of a judgment call than the law. So, if you are determined that you have to report, then, there's not really much much else that you need to investigate. But if you have determined that you can report, but you don't have to, then the next question is, should you report, right? So some of the things that you want to think about is first, you want to look at procedures in your organizations, right? So some organizations, especially organizations that routinely deal with abuse and people who in situations of abuse have policies, and it's important to review that. And it's also important to review it with your team. So depending on the type of team that you work with, you might have different things to take into account. So, at Tahrir, for example, we work as an interdisciplinary team, meaning that we're one integrated team. And this has its advantages and it has its challenges, and especially when it comes to reporting, because we might have different interest and different professional requirements within the team. And so what do you do? How do you approach things so that everybody gets to keep their license today, right? So that's something that you definitely want to look at and consult with your team. Now, if you work in a multidisciplinary team where your teams are going to be more siloed and isolated, that might not be much of a problem, because you reporting something is probably not going to affect your colleague with a different license that works essentially in a different department, right, in a different team. But if you work in an interdisciplinary team, this has to be a consultation amongst the team, no doubt about it. Even after, oh, I'm sorry, I moved too fast. Okay, even after you've determined that, you know, you can, and maybe you should, you know, looking at your team and looking at your organization, then you need to give agency to your client, right? Your client is the person who should have the last say. If it's not going to affect your license, right? I think working in a client-centered, trauma-informed way dictates that the client has agency to do that. What does your client want? And sometimes your client will say, well, I'll trust you, do whatever you want. And I don't know about you if that ever happens to you, but I'm never really satisfied with that. I never do whatever I want and never ask my client, right? So here, what I would suggest doing is sort of sitting down with your client and doing like a pros and con chart, give them information about the process, right? How do investigations go? And then look at essentially the safety considerations, because, like Marissa mentioned earlier, we know that the most dangerous time in a situation of domestic violence or intimate partner violence is at the point where people leave, and presumably, I'm assuming at the point where a report is made. And I'll talk a little bit more about police reports later, which are different types of report, but nevertheless, a report that signals, right, a change or shift in the relationship. And that brings danger with it. So, what does that mean to your client, right? If there is a report, CPS might contact the abuser, but is CPS going to protect them, right? They might need to leave. What does that mean in terms of shelter? Where can they go? Can they go to their parents' house? Can they go to a shelter? Do they have a safe place to go? Anonymity. It is anonymous. You can make an anonymous report. But honestly, if the report is about domestic violence, I mean, how many people are, going to, to make a report on domestic violence in a particular family? But it's anonymous to a point, right? I think when we're dealing, with child abuse, the children having different points of contact in the community, at school, daycare, etc., it's a little bit more anonymous than when we do a report for IPV or DV, right? That's usually kind of obvious who made the report, or at least who made the report or at least on behalf of whom the report was made, right? So that's what you want to do. The other thing is that you want to take care of your client's safety, but you want to take care of your own safety as well, because it is not rare in situations of domestic violence that the abuser will also try to contact or even harm the advocates that work with the person they're abusing. So if your organization is used to working with people in DV or IPV situations, I assume that you have safety protocols in place. Maybe your door is constantly locked and you have a camera, or etc. But if you're new to this, or if your organization is not, is not one that is used to doing this, I really suggest that you have some safety protocols in place. And even outside of your organization, right? So maybe for yourself as an advocate, as an attorney. So for example, I used to work very close to court, and I used to walk to court routinely. That's healthy, right? You walk to court. And I stopped doing it because one day my client's abuser came to court, and I didn't feel safe walking back to my office, knowing that he, could be somewhere and try to talk to me again. So I never walk to court anymore. So just kind of thinking about what do you do on your day-to-day that could put you at risk, and how you want to change that. The other safety consideration, and we can talk about this a little bit later, or also offline, because I know we have limited amount of time, but your client's immigration proceedings are not if your client is in immigration proceedings, they're not anonymous. It's very easy to find out with their A number or by going to court and actually looking through the docket sheets. I mean, the courts are a public space. It's really easy to find out when somebody has court and where. And so there are safety precautions that you can take on that front as well. Okay, so once you've determined whether you should report or not, you make your report. And then what other steps can you take? What else can you do sort of on the legal side to support your client? So let's see. And so there's a slight delay in me moving the slides. That's why I'm pausing really awkwardly. Okay, here we go. Okay, so best practices now for supporting them sort of more on the legal front of things. So the first thing that you can consider, and every single one of these things has to be considered kind of within the greater context of your client's case. So not every client is going to have the same needs. Not every client is going to want to have the same desires, but those are kind of things that you can do to put them in a better position than they were before. So one is protective order. So there are different types of protective orders. Obviously, there's just as many different types of protective orders as there are jurisdictions in the United States, right? But in general, there are some protective orders that are automatic and come with law enforcement involvement. So, for example, in Texas, and I think in Harris County, but I think in the whole of Texas, if there is a call for domestic violence and the police is called and there's an arrest made, even if there's no arrest made, but a report made, I think it comes with the report. A statement from the survivor will be taken, and then a magistrate will issue a 2-month protective order. So usually those protective orders are done as an emergency type of provision. They're very short usually because there's no court hearing, right? And so constitutionally, the perpetrator has a right to be heard in court, and there's some due process rights that have to be enforced here. So that's why they're typically short. And if they want a longer protective order, then they have to get a longer sort of normal protective order for your jurisdiction. And this can be done in a variety of ways. So they can be granted as part of family court proceedings. So if your client is also maybe married to that person, or if they have children in common and they have to go through custody proceedings, then most family courts can also grant protective orders. They can be granted as part of criminal court proceedings. If your client's abuser was arrested and charged, some criminal courts can grant those protective orders. And then finally, you can just sort of request them outside of these proceedings by petitioning a court. So in Texas, they're usually family courts. In Harris County, we have a special court with its own policies as well, right? But there is a special court in Harris County. For those of you in Harris County, it's the 280th, and you can petition it without going through a divorce, custody, or anything like that. Usually, the district attorney's offices in various jurisdictions have a family violence unit or victim services unit with lawyers and prosecutors who specialize in protective orders, particularly in larger jurisdictions. So in Harris County, there is a pretty big department, and they do file protective orders and have advocates for victims. So that's a really good resource. But otherwise, if you are an attorney, you can apply for your client, you can accompany your client to court. If you're a social worker, there are many things that you can do in addition to referring them to places where they can get help to get the protective order. Now, again, safety planning is very, very important, because the grant of a protective order can also be a particularly dangerous point. It's another turning point in the relationship. And for some people, a protective order is going to be enough to sort of deter them and say, well, I really don't want to go to jail. If I mess up, I'm really going to jail with this piece of paper between me and my sorry, I have the Spanish word that comes to my partner, so I'm good, I'm done. And then for others, it's just going to make them even more angry, right? And increase the risk at the time. So again, before filing any sort of protective order, remember to safety plan. It's very important. The next thing that you can do for your client, besides protective order, especially obviously when we're dealing with youngsters, it's emancipation, right? And that comes into play when the parents or guardians are complicit, or they're not cooperative, or maybe when they're the abusers, right? And I think here, my particular thought about emancipation is when it comes to forced marriage. And really, this is my plug for Tahereh's forced marriage initiative. We have a link in the materials. But forced marriage is still a big problem in the United States. We tend to think about, forced marriage as something that happens somewhere else, but it is definitely a form of family violence here. And not necessarily a family violence within the nuclear family of the person being forced to marry, but often forced marriage means a very, very poor outcomes in terms of the relationship. So what we see in the United States, and we see it in all kinds of communities, but we often see it when people are forced to marry for religious reasons, for reasons, for immigration reasons even, right? Or they're taken abroad to marry in more traditional ways, etc. So here, often parents are not necessarily abusive because they think they're doing the best thing that they can for their child, but that is not what the child wants, right? And so obviously the parents are not going to cooperate to protect their child. So that's when emancipation becomes a really important tool to protect the child, right? Because the child has nowhere else to go. And being emancipated rather than being sort of under the grip of their family is the best outcome. So sometimes it's automatic in some states through marriage. We've worked a lot at Tahereh to eliminate forced or eliminate child marriage, not necessarily forced, but child marriage. And in a lot of states, including Texas, it is no longer the law that you can marry as a child, but there's still many jurisdictions in which children can marry, and they would become automatically emancipated at this point, but not always. And then otherwise, it's a court order, and that can be done through legal aid, children advocacy organizations, and then you, as an attorney, right, can also file for your child client. And then the considerations are the same, right? Safety always, but here also sort of the best interest analysis, and including financial, where's the child going to live today? And in a lot of jurisdictions, you have to have means, you have to show that the child is already able to live on their own. There's also in a lot of states, or in most states, a threshold age. In Texas, it's 16, for example. You cannot get a 13-year-old emancipated. It's 16, the threshold. Okay. Now, the next thing that you can help your client through is law enforcement reporting. I'm going to go a little bit faster because I know that we're almost at time. But law enforcement reporting is also a big piece, because when you're working with immigrant children, or any immigrant really, you're also dealing with the fear of law enforcement, and a fear that is sort of different than what you might encounter with U.S. citizens. They're afraid of being deported. They're afraid of being, reported to the federal authorities, and honestly, sometimes with good reason, right? So the first thing here is to know your law enforcement agencies, know what their policies are, know if they're part of the 387G program, which is the program by which local authorities cooperate with immigration enforcement. Know their policy about, asking survivors for status, whether they will, ask for status at booking if people get arrested, because often they just kind of take everybody into custody. It's not rare, especially when the police officers dispatched do not speak your client's language. They sometimes arrest everybody and sort of sort it out when they book them. And for US citizens, that might not be a great, hurdle to overcome, to have been booked somewhere and then released and no charges filed. But for an immigrant in a jurisdiction that will cooperate with federal law enforcement, it's potentially life-changing, right? So just make sure that you know who you're reporting to. So for example, here in the Houston area, I would have no problem reporting to the Houston police or the Harris County sheriff. But if the crime happens in Conroe, we are not talking to the Conroe police, right? Because we know that they will ask for status, and we know that they that they're happy to call ICE on even on survivors. We've seen it, so we don't do it. The other thing to take into consideration with law enforcement, if you do decide to report, is that you can provide support to your client. And the first thing that you can do is ask the police to come to you. So you don't have to do it at the police station where it's kind of, scary. I've had the police come to my office several times to take reports. They can do it also at shelters. There's some shelters that have agreements with police officers, and maybe they have a police officer that comes once a week to take reports, etc. So kind of talk through their victim services and see how that can happen. And then you can be present and provide support to your client. You can even speak for them. I mean, you are their attorney, and with your client consent, you can help them through the interview. And then make sure that you have them follow up, right? For many reasons. One of them is also linked to immigration, but do follow up. It's really important if you want something to happen in the case. The other thing to do with regards to law enforcement once you report is to register with the victim notification programs. Each state, or most states, will have one. In Texas, it's called Texas Vines, and Texas Vines will notify a victim anytime something happens in the case, right? So if there's a sentence, if there is maybe a parole hearing, if the perpetrator is getting out of jail, and that will help them keep safe. And also there can be all sorts of confidentiality provisions put in place so that their address is not released, etc. And then discuss the pros and cons. It's always your client's choice in the end, even if you feel that it's safe. They might not want to report, right? The con could be, they have children together and they want their kids to still see their dad, or, even though there was abuse, now there is a child support order in place, and they really can't do without the child support. And if the perpetrator is in jail, they won't have that child support. And those are really not trivial, right? It could really mean the difference between having food on the table for your children and not having food on the table for your children. And that is a real consideration. On the pro side, obviously you want to be able to document the abuse, promote public safety. You can also apply for CVC, which is crime victims compensation. Most states have a crime victim compensation statute where you can get compensated for expenses related to the crime, like medical expenses. And then it opens the door to the possibility of a U visa for some of our clients who are undocumented. So immigration protections, I'm going to go very, very quickly. And I'm also going to offer my email address. I think it is somewhere in this, I think it's somewhere in this presentation. We do technical assistance. So I'm happy to provide technical assistance on any of these forms of relief that might become available to your client if your client experienced DV or IPV. We also provide asylum technical assistance, but it's not on this slide because not part of the presentation today. But any of these forms of relief have an abuse component that really, these are basically the silver lining of the situation that your client finds themselves in if they are if if they are in a situation of violence. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on regarding immigration protections is, manage your client's expectations. The wait times are very long, and not every form of relief comes with protections when they're filed. So know your forms of relief and which ones will protect your client better in the meantime, because most people will have to wait several years at this point for any form of tangible protection. So which one will be better at protecting their client? Are they in removal proceedings? Are they not in removal proceedings? Do they need a work permit? Do they not need a work permit? All these things to take into account. Take into account whether they want to include non-abusive parents. So for example, they might be eligible for VAWA, but they wouldn't be able to include their parents. Whereas for our clients under the age of 21, if they file for a U visa, they can include their parents. And that can be very important to them. Keeping families together is very important. And then keep in mind that law enforcement cooperation might be a prerequisite or extremely important in most of these forms of relief. And then one thing to do before they leave or as they're leaving is get documents. Don't leave without anything. If you can at all, make copies or take pictures of, their passports, if they are US citizens or anything like that, any sort of documents that could help prove an immigration case. And in the resources, we have a checklist, and have them take that. It will really facilitate the upcoming, immigration battles. I'll turn it back to Marissa.
Thank you so much, Natalie and Samantha, for such valuable guidance. We are grateful for all you do. As immigrant children advocates, you'll often work with clients who have faced traumatic and life-changing events. We know all that. It's important to note that even though the trauma might have not happened to you, it can still affect you in a significant way, especially if you do not incorporate self-care. Here at SELA, we strongly believe in the value of self-care for our overall well-being. We try to always highlight self-care in most of our resources and training, such as this one. It's a reminder to all of us that this work is not easy and that it's essential to honor and advocate for your needs just as we do for our clients. This is that reminder. Unfortunately, self-care does not come naturally to some, especially to highly empathetic people, as many in this line of work seem to be. Highly empathetic people tend to be givers, supporters, selfless, but at times they also tend to be overachievers where they struggle with saying no and end up taking more than they could handle. If this is describing you, I want you to know that being empathetic is a wonderful thing. Never lose that. But do not forget to attend to your own needs along the way. Forgetting to do self-care, setting boundaries, or saying no can leave anyone emotionally and physically drained by more susceptible for various mental health challenges, such as burnout, compassion fatigue, or secondary traumatic stress. Remember, self-care is not only a good idea, but a necessity and a professional ethical obligation. It's so important that the code of ethics for both attorneys and social workers, for example, include a section on self-care. As service providers, we have the obligation not only to ourselves, but to those we serve, our colleagues and our loved ones. Professional self-care is vital for competent and ethical work practice. I have included some simple but helpful tips on how to incorporate some self-care on this slide. Of course, self-care is different for everyone. However, I think it can be helpful to hear and learn from what has worked for others as inspiration or ideas. I want to take the opportunity to ask Natalie and Samantha if they have any tips for us. I have one question in particular regarding boundaries. We know that they are so important to set either between you or your client, boundaries between you, your professional and personal life. How does this look for you, and how does one go about implementing boundaries? Do you want to go first, Natalie?
Sure. I think it really is essential. And like you said, Marissa, it does not always come easily, especially when you're dealing with people who are in crisis, who have survived really complex trauma. But it really is essential for our well-being as advocates and for the client. It's one of the ways that we can really help them as they heal, right? And as they recover from what they've been through. it can help provide structure for them that they may not have had, previously. And so, and it preserves the advocate's ability to continue doing the work, continue advocating and empowering our clients, which is what we want to do. And so, even just during phone calls, just kind of trying, being able to remain calm when someone's in crisis. And if, the conversation gets, off track, kind of gently and kindly redirecting it to the topic at hand, that can really help survivors organize their thoughts and, put some more structure into their lives. And I'm sure Samantha has ideas on that too.
Yes, I would love to hear that.
Yeah, it's a battle. It's not easy. That is for sure. I think, one of the things is to just be really, consistent and clear about the nature of your relationship with your client. And it's easier said than done, and easier with some clients than others. But from the outset, just repeating, I'm here for you, but I'm not here for you all the time and for everything, right? One thing that I do, I don't answer phone calls past a certain time, even if I actually see the call, right? I just don't. If it's an emergency, they'll leave a message and they don't know that I listen to the message, but I'm not 24/7. I don't answer calls or emails 24/7. That's the first thing. And if it is an emergency that is not mine to take care of, then I will refer them to the proper place. So that's one of the ways. But clarity and consistency, I would say, in implementing what your relationship has to look like.
Thank you so much for sharing. Due to time, we're going to go ahead and move forward, but I really appreciate your feedback on this. As I mentioned, self-care does not have to be complicated. And just keep in mind that you are the expert on yourself. Find what works best for you. It does not have to be perfect. It just has to be perfect for you. We have some time. We don't have a lot of time to answer questions, but we're going to answer a few. But if for some reason we're not able to get to your question, we're going to go ahead and download the questions that are pending in the Q&A. We'll make sure that we answer those questions at a later time. But let me open here, see what kind of questions we have. Okay, so the first one is, in such situations, if the guardian is the abuser, how would you prepare your client for a report? Would this mean having to find a different guardian?
I'll let you take that, Sam. I think you have good.
Yeah, sorry, I was having issues unmuting myself. Yes. So in some situations it might, right? It really depends on the nature of the report, on what's going on, right? So for example, years ago, I had a client who we felt she was neglected because her her guardian, it was not her parents, her guardian wouldn't let her go to school. And they felt like, religiously, girls shouldn't go to school, et cetera, right? And in this situation, she ended up not having to find a new guardian because the situation was not one where things escalated, right? It was more of explaining, what are the laws and what children should be doing at her age in the United States. And so it really depends on the situation. Also, depending on the age of the child, right? They will go just like any other child into CPS custody if necessary. So it would be sort of the same as any other child, but definitely it might mean finding a different guardian. So that's an additional consideration.
Thank you so much. Due to time, we're going to go ahead and download all the questions, but we'll make sure that they get answered, and we're going to go ahead and move forward. We have created a very robust list of resources that we're going to make sure that everyone that was able to attend the webinar gets a copy of that. And this is going to help with guiding and navigating this challenging situation with your client and yourself. Also, please don't forget, if you are going to be requesting CLE or CEUs, please, those surveys have been posted on the chat. Please complete them if you want to get those CEs or CLEs. And also, please don't forget to, if you don't mind, please complete the feedback survey. That'll help us learn more about, what we're doing right, where we need to improve, and also ideas for future trainings as well. We welcome you to stay connected with us, check out our resources and record trainings, attend future trainings, join a working group, request technical assistance nationwide, and sign up for a monthly newsletter. Thank you all for being here. And it was great. Thank you, Samantha. Thank you, Natalie, for providing such amazing and helpful information concerning very difficult times. We'll make sure everybody gets a copy of the PowerPoint, and the recording will be posted on our website, and we'll make sure that the questions that we didn't get to get answered. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.